This is Beyond the Margins, where we go deeper into story, creativity, and the courage it takes to speak your truth. Join host Jen Chambers each week for writing inspiration, conversations with creative minds, the yearly 12-week Artist Sway series, or the Write Your Story series, all designed to help you find, shape, and share your voice. Because your story doesn't end on the page, it begins beyond the margins.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is Beyond the Margins. Today's episode is called Persephone and the Nature of Change, 5 years after. I want to talk about something we all know a lot better than we'd like to. Something we know pretty intimately, but we just don't think about it a lot. The idea of change. Not the kind that we schedule. Not the kind that, if you're like me, we plan in lists or goals. I try not to, but I still do that. The kind of change that arrives suddenly, that rearranges our lives when we're still trying to understand what's happening. Almost exactly 5 years ago, as we all know, the world changed. In early 2020, the spread of the virus that became known as COVID-19 forced everyone, the world, to stop in ways that most of us had never ever experienced. Everything closed. Cities were quiet. Airplanes were grounded. We all learned phrases like flatten the curve and social distancing. Many of us stayed inside our houses for weeks or months. It was years for me because of my chronic illness. It was a lot harder for me to go out until everybody was safe. But the real story wasn't only isolation, it was transformation. Something happened to all of us during that time that probably most of us barely understand now and might never really understand. Everything changed. Everything. Our sense of time changed. Our priorities shifted. Some relationships got deeper. Some dissolved. Many of us faced grief or uncertainty or illness ourselves. The environment actually got better for a while as people stopped polluting. That was pretty beautiful. I wish that still happened. But as a culture, we also discovered different ways to be resilient. And 5 years later, it's worth asking questions about that. It feels almost philosophical. But what did that time change in us? And what does it mean to have lived through a transformation like that we never asked for? I feel like I have enough distance from it now to kind of think about it. Most of us lost someone during that time period, or we lost something big, even if it wasn't people. I lost a big chunk of my children's childhood in one way, but I also was able to connect with them in a different way that I would have been able to without that. So it's worth thinking about. There's no good answers. It's kind of a bittersweet thing, but because it is almost exactly 5 years since COVID, I've been thinking about it a lot. And I thought a good way to kind of explore it is to talk about a myth that has helped humans understand change for thousands of years. And that's the story of Persephone. The archetype of Persephone is in Greek mythology. She's the daughter of Demeter, who's the goddess of the harvest and of the earth. So as the story goes, one day Persephone is gathering flowers in a meadow. She's surrounded by spring, the world is bright and alive. And suddenly the earth opens up and cracks at her feet. She's taken into the underworld by Hades, the god of the underworld. So the myth tells us that Demeter, who's just absolutely devastated by the loss of her daughter, she lets the earth fall into darkness. Nothing grows, and winter spreads across the land. Eventually, a compromise is reached. Persephone will spend part of the year in the underworld and part of the year above ground with her mother. Some of that is based on the fact that she ate some of the pomegranate seeds which is interesting because that isn't always talked about when they kind of gloss over the big story of this tale, but it kind of gives her a little bit of ownership, because Persephone is also often depicted as the maiden, right? So this gives her some agency in her own story a little bit. So she spends part of the year above ground and part below. And that cycle then became the rhythm of the seasons: winter, spring, death, rebirth. On the surface, it's also a story about agriculture and the seasons, but psychologically, Persephone represents something deeper. She represents the part of life we can't control. The moment when we're pulled into change, whether we're ready or not. In many ways, the pandemic years felt like a collective descent into the underworld. Suddenly, everything familiar disappeared. Normal routines and things vanished. Plans evaporated. We were forced into stillness and uncertainty. And some of us experienced loss. Others experienced profound loneliness. Many people faced illness and fear. And like Persephone, we didn't choose that. But the myth of Persephone also tells us something hopeful. She doesn't remain a captive forever. When she returns to the surface world each spring, she's not the same innocent girl who picked flowers in the meadow. She's become something else. She's a queen. She's a woman who has walked through darkness and returned with knowledge. In other words, Persephone represents transformation. The kind of transformation that only happens after you've lived through something difficult. So what changed in us collectively? If we pause and look honestly at the last 5 years, of course, you could see the changes everywhere. Some are visible. So many people changed jobs or careers. Remote work transformed how millions of people organized their lives. Cities were changed. Some of them never went back to the same way they were before. Education changed. Some for the better, some for the worse. Healthcare changed. Same thing. But the deeper changes happened inside of us. We learned how, even though we didn't want to know, we learned how fragile our systems can be. We learned, like, our physical selves and our social systems. We learned how deeply we need connection. And we learned something really simple, when you think about it, the importance of things that are ordinary. It really forced you to think about how grateful you were for your coffee in the morning and taking a walk outside when you were forced to be in your house 90% of the time. Those times when you were allowed out for just a short time, you could wave at your neighbors. There were people out there, people you didn't know. I didn't necessarily get to know my neighbors very well, but everyone became friendly, or at least friendlier. I mean, those sort of small things mattered more. Because when the world stopped, we realized how much we'd taken for granted. And, of course, this is a very hopeful and positive view. There were a lot of bad things that happened during that time as well. In the Persephone myth, spring itself only arrives after winter has done its work. And maybe that's the question, a better question, for what we're living with now. What new spring is growing out of the changes we've experienced? Hopefully something different politically, just speaking from my own point of view. Certainly in the events of the last couple of weeks. But one of the strangest things about the pandemic years is how our experience of time changed. It's so weird to try and remember it. The fact that we all lived through that is just absolutely, talk about the word gobsmacked is a great word. But I mean, it's absolutely mind-boggling that we all lived through this together. And time meant nothing. Days, weeks, it was all blurred together. Stuff was endless, but at the same time, somehow things went really quickly. Scientists talk about this concept. It's liminal time. It's the space between. It's the space between what was and what will be. We're in the middle. In mythology, those liminal spaces is where the transformation happens. The doorways or the crossroads, the shoreline between the land and the sea, and the underworld. That's exactly where Persephone lives for half the year, right? In that myth, the underworld isn't just a place of darkness, it's a place of pause. It's where things slow down before it begins again. During the pandemic, many of us just existed in that liminal space. We didn't know what was going to happen. We just had to hold the people close that were with us and do our best. Everything was changing so quickly. But at the same time, commutes disappeared, calendars emptied. For so many people, it created enormous stress. For other people, it opened a different kind of clarity. And people began asking questions that usually were too busy to ask. What really matters? What do I want my life to look like? What am I willing to change? It was pretty great. We actually had been on the cusp of that kind of a change within my family right before the pandemic happened. So not that it was a good timing. It wasn't, of course. Never good for that sort of thing. But we had planned for my husband to stop working and take a couple of years off. And so we were able to do that with less stress. It kind of worked out in a different way for us. And we were really able to dive into a transformation for our family and the way that things worked for us. The questions that liminal spaces bring up are things like, what am I willing to change? And those questions don't disappear after the crisis ends. They're part of the transformation. Now, history shows us that major disruptions often lead to cultural renewal. After the Black Death, for instance, Europe had the Renaissance. After world wars, entire societies rebuilt themselves in new ways. They had to. Periods of upheaval often create unexpected creativity. And we might still be in that stage now. New ideas about work, new conversations about mental health, new attention to community in a different way. I've been thinking about that so much. And even small things changed. Something stuck. People began gardening again. People walked more. People reconnected with nature. I kept those up. I hope a lot of other people did too. Those were things that meant a lot to me during that liminal time that have become a lot bigger part of my life. And those changes mirror something in the ancient world. Because in the Persephone story, right, spring doesn't just appear magically. It arrives because someone returns from the underworld. In other words, something to be renewed, it happens because something has been learned in the darkness. And maybe that's where we are now. We're not fully back to what life once was, and we never will be, probably, but we're standing somewhere new. We're watching those first little green shoots appear in the spring. You might want to take a few minutes, if you like this subject, to reflect or write about these questions as journal prompts. The first one, what changed in your life during the pandemic that you now see differently 5 years later? What changed? Number 2, what did that period teach you about what truly matters in your life? And number 3, if this moment now is your spring after winter, what new growth do you want to nurture now? There's no right answer. They're just invitations to notice how your own story has evolved. You don't have to write about it. You could just think about it. It's interesting. It's really interesting to give yourself that time to really acknowledge where you're at and why, and what you might want differently. If you'd like, let's take a few minutes together for a short meditation. I haven't been back to these for a while, and I felt very called to do that today. If you can, sit comfortably. Let your shoulders relax. and take a slow breath in through your nose. And let it go with a sigh out your mouth. Now imagine yourself standing at the edge of a meadow. It's early spring. The air is cool, but soft. The ground beneath your feet is beginning to warm up after a long winter. Maybe your shoes are off and your toes are wiggling in the new grass. You notice small signs of life everywhere. There's tiny green shoots pushing through the soil. Birdsong returning to the morning. There's the quiet miracle of things beginning again. Take another breath and imagine that this landscape represents your own life. The last few years might have felt like winter. It's been a season of uncertainty or loss or just deep change. It's not easy. But winter is never the end of the story. Under the surface, life has been gathering strength. The roots have been growing. The seeds are waiting. Possibilities are forming quietly in the dark, ready to spring out of the ground. Imagine the sun rising over the meadow and warmth spreading slowly across the ground. And with every breath, something inside of you begins to open again. Breathe in hope. Breathe in curiosity. Breathe in energy. And exhale all of the old. You might not be the same person you were 5 years ago. I know I'm not. But like Persephone returning to the world, you carry something new now. You carry wisdom and resilience and a deeper understanding of what matters. Let's take one more slow breath. And when you're ready, gently return to the room around you. That was lovely. To close out, I wanted to say, if you're interested in exploring these ideas, I read a lot about myth and transformation. I think it's really interesting. Books about change, books about myth. Here's a few that I recommend. Not just myth, also transformation. The first is Women Who Run with the Wolves. This is a powerful book. It's an exploration of myth through archetypes and feminine psychological transformation. I cannot recommend that enough. Great, great book. Kirka, which is a beautiful retelling of Greek mythology that explores personal transformation and the idea of finding your power. Oh, there's this great book called Wintering. It was one of the most thoughtful books that I had read that was written during the pandemic about the quiet seasons of life when everything slows down. Then, of course, The Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell. Classic. It's an exploration of how myths help us understand the patterns of humans and our experience. And lastly, this book by a woman who I was lucky enough to know, Sonia Renee Taylor, called The Body Is Not an Apology. This is on the transformation side. It's a book that argues, the explanation from the cover says, quote, "It's a book that argues body shame is the tool of oppression and not a personal failing, and it promotes a radical self-love idea as the antidote to dismantle systems of injustice." So it's talking about personal transformation. I very, very much recommend that. She's wonderful. If you look up Sonia Renee Taylor, she does classes online. She does readings. Incredibly smart person. Very, very good book. Now, 5 years ago, the world changed, and it's ways that we're still trying to understand. I think of it like my grandma used to talk about the Great Depression. You know, there's some wounds there that will never fully be healed. But the story of Persephone reminds us that change has always been part of the human experience. Every life contains seasons. There's moments of descent and waiting and return. And spring always arrives eventually. The question isn't whether the change will come, it always does. The real question, is what we carry with us when we emerge from the underworld. Thank you for listening today. It's been Beyond the Margins, and I'm Jen Chambers. I'll see you next week.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Our stories are brilliant. We are resilient. Our stories